The former British colony of Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, was once embroiled in a complex civil war of race, liberation, and Cold War era politics known as the Bush War from 1964 up until 1979. As the tide of the war began to escalate, the Rhodesian government would employ the use of foreign volunteers in a bid to maintain their white minority led government for the foreseeable future under Ian Smith. These foreign volunteers would be controversial in the eyes of the governments from which they came from. This is the tale of the Rhodesian Bush War and its foreign volunteers. The beginning of the war. There weren't many foreign volunteers at the start of the conflict in 1964. The war, at its early stages, would be fought at a fairly low level of intensity, as the black nationalist movements of ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, and later the emergence of a breakaway group, ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe. These two groups would begin their armed struggle for a black majority rule in 1964, starting with farm attacks on white owned farms. The following year, on the 11th of November 1965, Rhodesia would declare its unilateral Declaration of Independence in an attempt to keep their white minority led government in power, against that of Britain's wish for a majority black rule. This illegal independence would further escalate black resentment in the country, although spurred on from the recent independences of other African nations at the time, such as the Congo, Ghana, and Zambia. However, the British government and the United Nations disregarded Rhodesia's independence and sought to bring about an end to the Rhodesian government by forcing upon Rhodesia harsh sanctions. Rhodesia would be outcast in the eyes of the international community following its illegal independence and subsequent sanctions. Despite these sanctions, the tiny Rhodesian military, which at its peak only had some 10,000 active personnel, would still prove to be a formidable fighting force, being well armed and equipped with the help of its few remaining allies, mainly being South Africa. South Africa would supply Rhodesia in military equipment and oil to maintain its fighting force against the communist insurgency. Rhodesia would also be assisted in combating the insurgency of ZANU and ZAPU's armed resistance with the help of its unofficial ally. Portugal would also provide assistance to Rhodesia in maintaining the growing insurgencies of ZANU and ZAPU's bases and training facilities, with these insurgent bases being located in the Portuguese colonial territory of neighboring Mozambique. The Portuguese colonial troops would also fight a guerrilla war of their own within Mozambique at the time, against the black Mozambique nationalist movement of Frelimo. Both nations would find common ground as they would battle against black nationalist movements within their controlled borders. In the first phase of the war, Rhodesia's military would be able to contain and control the insurgency within the country, thus driving insurgent bases out and into neighboring countries along Rhodesia's border. ZANU and ZAPU would struggle in their effectiveness against the Rhodesian government and military in the early years of the war, as these two groups would suffer from several internal differences and divisions. Escalation. The outlook for Rhodesia's future began to change and sour in the early to mid 1970s as the war would gain continued escalation and momentum, followed by the increased involvement of Communist China and the Soviet Union in military backing of equipment and aid to the guerrilla fighters of ZANU and ZAPU. The war's escalation would also in turn result in the ever decreasing numbers amongst the white population left in Rhodesia due to immigration away from the increased violence and ambushes. This white flight would also hamper the Rhodesian military, as they would have less soldiers to choose from in their white draft pool. The outlook for Rhodesia continued to get worse following the Carnation Revolution back in Lisbon, Portugal on April the 25th, 1974. This military coup would oust the unpopular Portuguese government of the time and bring about an end to its unpopular colonial wars in Africa. The end of Portugal's colonial wars would bring newfound independence for its former African colonies, including Mozambique, who would gain its independence just the following year in 1975. Mozambican independence would to create a great economic impact for Rhodesia. The landlocked nation would no longer have access and Portuguese permission and guidance to key Indian Ocean ports of Beira and Maputo to import and export essential goods. Overall, increasingly worsening the economic isolation of this sanctioned nation. Portugal's withdrawal from Mozambique would give the Rhodesians an extra hostile front to contend with the newly elected Mozambique government of Frelimo sympathetic for the Zimbabwean nationalist cause. Rhodesia would now face increased incursions from three hostile fronts. Their already tiny military stretched ever more thin. To combat this lack of personnel, Rhodesia would introduce more black soldiers into their security forces. At one point, 80% of Rhodesia's security forces were made up of black soldiers. With mounting political pressure from the international community and an ever escalating war being fought with a lack of personnel, Rhodesia's outlook seemed doomed. Rhodesia's roll of the dice. With the end of the war seemingly out of sight, facing increased opposition as well as dwindling troop numbers, Rhodesia would roll the dice to find a solution to fix these issues. They would not go down without a fight, and in the mid 1970s, they would begin an international recruitment campaign in an attempt to recruit more white personnel from English speaking nations into their ranks. Many of these volunteers had heard little or nothing about the conflict due to the Rhodesian government's control of international media into the country in the early stages of the war, as well as being overshadowed by the Vietnam War in media coverage and public scrutiny. The most successful of these Rhodesian recruitment drives would be that of the ads placed in the Soldier of Fortune mercenary magazine. Soldier of Fortune would report on conflicts from around the world and promote certain mercenary opportunities. The very first issue, published in 1975, titled Mercenaries in Africa, spoke of the author Robert Brown's trip to Rhodesia in the spring of 1974. The magazine would feature the famous Be a Man Among Men recruitment posters, as well as information on how to join the Rhodesian struggle. The magazine's subsequent popularity and its future issues would routinely cover the conflict up until its end. Siding with the Rhodesians, Soldier of Fortune would garner a reputation for siding with those opposed to communism, regardless of their racial viewpoints. The magazine would also shed light to the Western world first hand accounts of the Bush War. These volunteers would have different reasons for joining, some attempting to live the life of a soldier of fortune, looking for thrills, some other so called Cold War warriors who believed communism was eating Africa alive, believing communism would lead to the decline of Western and Christian civilization. They believed Rhodesia was the place where a true battle of communism and Western civilization was taking place. Some volunteered, believing it to be a race war, with some 80% of the Rhodesian security forces being black. This was not the case. Foreign volunteers with strong extreme racial viewpoints would also be deported from Rhodesia once found out. Those volunteers considered suitable applicants would receive information packs from the Rhodesian government. These volunteers would then in turn send their documentation back to Salisbury. However, these documents would often be intercepted by foreign governments trying to deter their citizens from joining the Rhodesian security forces. Several governments, including the United States and Britain, outlawed any of its citizens joining the Rhodesian security forces. Enforcing this law would be difficult to maintain, as those willing to join would still find a way to get in. These governments did not want its citizens joining, mainly to not interfere in another foreign country's internal affairs, preventing destabilization in the region, and to uphold international sanctions. These volunteers would then be offered a rank in the security forces based on their prior military experience. Regardless of experience, all foreigners were required to complete basic Rhodesian training. Even up until 1977, Rhodesia would pay for potential volunteers and their airline fees if they could not afford to pay so themselves. Most foreigners would go on to join the well trained Rhodesian Light Infantry, one of the main counter-insurgency units in Rhodesia. Later on in the war, from 1976, the Rhodesian Light Infantry would adapt a more airborne approach to its operations. The men of the Rhodesian Light Infantry would go on to make more parachute jumps than any other military unit in history. These foreigners would also be allowed to bring in their own firearms into Rhodesia itself. Often you can see M16s and other rifles not issued to the Rhodesian regular forces. Overall, these foreigners would largely be welcomed. However, there were concerns that they were more keen to fight in a war, regardless of their commitment to Rhodesia itself. There were also thoughts that it would be problematic for non Rhodesians to sustain Rhodesia's independence. These foreigners would not serve under their own command, in their own exclusively foreign unit, but would serve in most cases under and amongst the Rhodesians. Volunteers were subject to the same pay as their Rhodesian counterparts, most of the Rhodesians being conscripts. Foreigners would also take on multiple different roles outside the regular Rhodesian forces for different reasons. If a foreigner was deemed too old for active service or unfit for the military, they could either join the British South African police force in maintaining law and order in Rhodesia instead. Some foreigners would take up jobs as security on large farms protecting the loss of cattle and to deter guerrillas patrolling through the area. These security jobs on large farms would become popular amongst older volunteers for its higher pay. Of these foreign volunteers, some 300 Americans would join the Rhodesian security forces, most of them being Vietnam War veterans, experienced in guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency. As the Vietnam War began to come to its end, professional soldiers would employ their trade in many other outlets of the world. A number of American volunteers found the conditions in the bushes of Rhodesia to be tough, leaving many to desert before their contract ended. 80% of Americans who would join the Rhodesian security forces would end up deserting. There would still be a handful of excellent American soldiers and field commanders remaining. A group of American soldiers fighting in Rhodesia would come to form an informal unit known as the Crippled Eagles. Their badge and their name created by author Robin Moore, who would publish several books on the conflict. The crippled eagle would come to symbolize the Americans and their own disapproval for their government back home, for its abandonment of its nationals and its cause in Rhodesia. A number of ANZAC forces from Australia and New Zealand would join in the fight as well, most having combat experience in Vietnam. Desertion rates, on the other hand, among the ANZAC units was low. They would too provide a good fighting record. Volunteers would come from Britain as well, of which some had links to its former British colony. Volunteers from neighbouring South Africa would also come to the call. South Africa, a long term ally with Rhodesia, would also provide covert security forces operating within Rhodesia in Rhodesian uniform to protect certain infrastructure and interests for the South African government, such as railway networks and bridges that were the lifeline to Rhodesia and its already crippled economy. Amazingly, a number of Albanian soldiers were to be involved in this complex war. Leka Zogu, the pretend heir to the Albanian monarchy, visited Rhodesia on the run from persecution from the communist Albanian government. This exiled royal family arrived in Rhodesia with an entourage of hundreds of anti communist Albanians, most of whom being former royal guards. Zogu, an extreme anti communist, would provide a small detachment of highly trained former royal guards to fight the insurgency once war broke out. Later on, in 1977, Leka Zogu would ask the Rhodesian government to train a battalion of Albanians, to which he hoped to recruit to use in a coup in an attempt to retake Albania. The Rhodesian government simply never gave a formal reply. In November of 1977, the Rhodesians would bend their rules and allow for the first and last time its own fully foreign unit, that of the newly formed 7th Company. This unit would consist of mainly French speaking soldiers, most being ex legionnaires. This French unit was allowed mainly due to language and miscommunication amongst English speaking units, and also to the fact that the war was ever escalating and troops were needed. However, this French experiment would soon turn out to be a massive failure. The French believed that they had signed up as highly paid mercenaries, disgruntled to the fact that they received the same pay as their Rhodesian counterparts. Many of the French would soon leave after their first bush trip. In the field and during operations in which this company was involved in, their performance was below standard. The French's issues in communicating with the local black population led to tension amongst the French and the locals. After a series of disastrous events, including friendly fire, a lack of discipline, and a high casualty rate, this French unit would ultimately be disbanded just a few months later in May of 1978. Meanwhile, the black nationalist movements of ZANU and ZAPU believed this new influx of foreign fighters showed that the Western governments supported the Rhodesians, as they were unable to stop the flow of foreign volunteers into the country. By 1977, the war had become center stage, as the lives lost by the Rhodesians began to increase more than ever since the start of the war some 13 years prior. The Rhodesians were not in the position, militarily or politically, to sustain their war effort in an escalated war forever. Even with the help of the foreign volunteers, it simply would not be enough. The Rhodesians would eventually seek for a solution that would not only bring an end to the war and the sanctions, but a solution that would ensure that the white minority would still feel an element of power and control in any future possibly led black ruled Rhodesia. Looking for an end. The solution that the Rhodesians found was in that of a settlement with majority black leaders that would hold its first talks in December of 1977. The Rhodesians would make a turnaround in their political viewpoints, as the postponement of majority rule was no longer an option. Under international pressure, the talks of the internal settlement would conclude on the 3rd of March of 1978. The agreement of this new settlement would allow for the first time the creation of an interim government, which would include black Africans in leading positions, but with the white minority still in control of key areas of government, such as the military and the police force. Not all white Rhodesians remaining in the country would welcome the idea of an internal settlement. Shortly after the settlement was signed, the far right Rhodesian Action Party would hold a rally to denounce Ian Smith and his Rhodesian Front Party. They believed that this internal settlement was an act of treason. A major factor would hinder the success of the general election, as ZAPU and ZANU would not be involved in the process. They believed this election did not represent all Zimbabwean people. Ultimately, Bishop Muzorewa of the UANC party would win the election. The country would shortly be renamed after Zimbabwe Rhodesia. The new name for the country and its new flag would help to show the world the process of a new Rhodesian transitional government. The Western governments believed the internal settlement and the newly formed nation of Zimbabwe Rhodesia was a step in the right direction towards majority rule, but the lifting of sanctions was still not to be, as ZANU and ZAPU were not involved in any political talks or the general election of 1979. Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe believed Bishop Muzorewa to be a sellout to the whites. They vowed to continue the fighting, and the war would continue, despite the new Zimbabwe Rhodesia. As the war would rage on into 1979, the British government, under the leadership of newly elected Margaret Thatcher, would take a more active role to try and find a end solution to the Bush War. For the first time, all parties, including ZANU and ZAPU, would hold negotiations that brought about the Lancaster House Agreement. On the 21st of December 1979, the Lancaster House Agreement would be signed, bringing about a ceasefire and a subsequent end to the war. This would result in the resumption of British rule until new elections could be held. The new elections would be observed by a British Commonwealth force, deployed to maintain law and order during the election process. Robert Mugabe's ZANU would win the first internationally recognized election, and he would become Zimbabwe's first prime minister in 1980. And so the nation of Zimbabwe, as we know it today, was created. The cost of Zimbabwean independence and the Rhodesian Bush War would come with a high sacrifice for both sides. An estimated 20,000 people would come to lose their lives in the Bush War. A large proportion of civilians would die in the conflict, with an estimated 9,000 civilian deaths recorded. The Rhodesian Bush War would be a unique conflict considering the racial dynamics involved, as well as the international support for both the black nationalist movements from the majority of the international governments and the support for the minority white Rhodesians through international volunteers and a few select allies. The presence of foreign fighters in Rhodesia would highlight the complex nature of modern conflicts and the challenges foreign governments endured trying to regulate and control the actions of non state actors. For the foreign volunteers left in the country, many of them would not trust Mugabe, communist or not. Very few knew what he would do in the future. Few would come to expect the landslide nature of Mugabe's election victory and the sheer ruthlessness to which he would rule over Zimbabwe in the oncoming decades. Mugabe would lead his nation, which was commonly referred to as the breadbasket of Africa, into the basket case of Africa. The next step for the Rhodesian veterans. The foreign volunteers knew their time in Rhodesia was at an end. Some would return home, others looking to apply their trade once more in other parts of the world. Many foreign volunteers who fought in Rhodesia would go on to join the South African Defence Force in the 1980s and be involved in the border wars along Angola. Many Rhodesian veterans who remained in the country would leave Zimbabwe once ZANU and Mugabe were in power. They would too follow their foreign volunteer comrades in joining the SADF in South Africa. The South African government was actively trying to recruit Bush War veterans into their ranks. This operation was codenamed Operation Winter. As a result of Operation Winter, an estimated 5,000 Rhodesian veterans were joining the SADF, including the foreign volunteers which had served as well. For the Albanian Leka Zogu, he would too leave Rhodesia and head for South Africa, where he would be given diplomatic status along with his family until 1993, when he would return to Albania for the first time in 54 years, since he was just 2 days old, following the downfall of the communist regime in Albania. However, he would soon be kicked out of his home country only the next day, as Leka Zogu would try to restore the monarchy in Albania. The new government saw him as a threat to their political stabilization. While Albania was in the midst of civil unrest following the failure of pyramid schemes and money laundering by the government, which put the country into financial ruin. Leka Zogu would return in 1997 in the midst of this chaos, hoping to once more restore the monarchy. He would be welcomed by thousands of pro monarchy Albanians. He would stand above the crowd, donning the iconic Rhodesian brushstroke camo gifted to him, some 17 years after the war had ended. Today, the veterans of the Rhodesian Bush War annually commence a memorial service in many different corners of the world. The Rhodesian Veterans Association has numerous different locations in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and South Africa. The often forgotten Rhodesian African Rifles, who made a great sacrifice as well, to have their own Veterans Association, where they hold annual reunions. For all Rhodesian veterans and those that lived in their now vanished country, many still maintain a strong sense of Rhodesian identity and pride in their actions and services for their ill-gone nation. As the saying goes amongst the Rhodesians, Rhodesians never die.